All right, well, we've got about 92 participants, so I think I'm going to start the lecture. And I just wanted to mention before we run this that there is some content that Dfinity has agreed to allow us to use, which is highlighted in this front screen here saying on page 39, and it belongs to Dfinity, and we're using it with permission. So I shall start this now. Welcome to Variables, Types, Functions, and Loops. I'm Ted Reinhardt. Hi there. Bonjour. I just wanted to say a little bit about me. I have been learning about the ICP since the Genesis event in May 2021. I like learning and helping others learn. I have a 40-year career under my belt in the computer field already. And I taught a module in the first boot camp. I'm based in Ottawa, Canada. So that's a little bit about me. So it should be no surprise that the agenda today is to cover off variables, types, functions, and loops. And the assumption is that you have some programming experience, but not necessarily in Motoko. So let's tackle the first subject of variables. In Motoko, there are three things that have to come together in order to declare a variable. You need a static name, a static type, and value to put into the variable. In Motoko, the var reserve word starts off the declaration followed by the name. So we can see var for variable, and it's just before the actual name. So var is the reserved word to declare a variable. Then we have the static name, the name of the variable. In this case, we're going to call it best language. And that's what we're going to be talking about, the best language that there is. And then we specify what type of variable best language is. In this case, it's type text. And I'll talk more about types a little bit later. And then we declare the actual initial value of the best language variable. In this case, I'm declaring that Python is the best language. And now that best language has actually been declared as a variable, I can assign another value to it by using the assignment operator. And I'm going to assign Motoko as the value for the best language. Another important type of variable is an immutable variable. So you can have an immutable declaration that relates a static name and a static type with a static value. And these are only present at runtime. In order to do an immutable declaration, we use the reserved word let instead of var. The structure is exactly the same as a variable declaration var, but we use let to say that it is immutable. So in this case, we're saying let launch date of type text be declared as the 1st of January 2022. So if you were to say that the launch date has been assigned a new date of 1st of February 2022, the compiler would actually complain and say that it expected a mutable assignment target. In other words, it was looking for a variable. You cannot overwrite an immutable declaration with a new value. In some languages, they call the immutable declarations constants. So now let's talk about types. If we revisit the declaration that we did for the variable best language, you see the item in red. It's the type declaration. And the way you read that semicolon text, it actually means of type text. So variable best language of type text is equal to Motoko. Similar to the children's toy, the Motoko compiler prevents the wrong shape, a value, from being put into the wrong box, a variable, function argument, or a return value of a different type. Motoko is a strongly typed language. If you're not familiar with typed languages, spend some time to understand this because it will save you a lot of time. So when you declare variables, all your variables have to have a type. And if you try to pass the wrong value, or if you try to um, assign the wrong value to a variable, you will get an error. So you cannot put a integer into a text field or a text value into a floating field. It just will generate an error. Likewise, if you are passing arguments to functions, they all have types that have to be declared. And if you pass the wrong type to a function, you will see an error that will pop up in the compiler. Likewise, when values are returned from functions, they also have to be typed. And if they do not match correctly, you will have an error that will show up. So Motoko is a type-safe language. And this caused me an enormous amount of misunderstanding at the beginning of my journey with Motoko, and it's important to understand. Motoko supports a number of primitive types, and more complicated types can be created by building upon these. So this slide has the summary of Motoko primitive types. You'll see from top to bottom, we'll just step through them. Bool is for Boolean values. Char is for Unicode characters. Text is for text literals. Float is for 64-bit floating point. Int is for unbounded integers. And then you've got a variety of ints here, which are specific bit size. So 8-bit, 16, 32, and 64-bit. Then there's the natural numbers, nat, which are non-negative integers with arithmetic unbounded, so super large numbers. And then there's the 8-bit, 16, 32, and 64-bit versions of those. And then there's blob, which is a binary large object. Principal holds principles, and error gives you your opaque error values. I'd suggest you stop in the video and look at these a little bit more detailed to familiarize yourself. So here's a simple smart contract that will accept input to a function called say, and we can see the input here. In this case, the input will be of type text, and that's what's here in the parenthesis. And the function will return the value also of type text. So this is essentially a smart echo contract. So let's say, for example, we wanted to change how the echo function worked, and we wanted it to handle nat values, natural numbers, instead of text. We could just change the type for nat. Equally, we could put another value in if we wanted to handle Boolean, and we could just change it for whatever type that we wanted this function to handle, and that's all it would take for it to behave differently, and it would enforce the type through the compiler. So there are quite a lot of variations here, but I just wanted to show you that that's all it would take. Here's a quick video I created just to drive home the point. let's explore functions a little bit more. In Motoko, functions are where the bulk of the logic's defined. A function is made up of declarations and expressions and function calls, and it's all packaged up to accomplish a specific task. And functions may accept arguments, and a function may also return a value. So to define a function, we use the reserved word func, and that we then declare the name of the function, in this case set, and if we have any arguments to the function, we have to declare the variable that will accept them, as well as define the type. So in this case, it's a natural number. And then we go on to declare if it returns anything. And in this case, it will return a value of type text. It's going to do this asynchronously. The bulk of the logic is between the curly braces. Here we see that it's going to set the value of counter. Counter would be defined elsewhere above in the canister logic. And then it returns the value after the function has completed, and it's returned of type text. So as mentioned before, a function can have a return value, and when you want to return a value, you have to declare the type that it is. So in this case, I'm returning a natural number, and I would be returning counter. And counter is used elsewhere in the program, which has been declared as a natural variable. Now, certain functions may only query the ledger, and when you want to do that, you declare the function as a query, so public query function. In this case, I want to return the value of the counter, and when you do that, it doesn't have to go through consensus to get the response back, as opposed to when you're writing to the ledger, it has to go through consensus. Now, not all functions have to return a value. In this case, you'll see on the far right, beside async, it has two parentheses. It says that means that there's no value being returned. In this case, this function is updating the ledger. And the async means don't wait for the response. It will arrive asynchronously versus awaiting for it. In Motoko, it's possible to have shared functions that are callable from another actor. And that's where the shared reserved word comes in. And you'll hear about that more later. So module imports for types. We're going to explore this a little bit now. So type float defines the 64-bit floating point numbers. So these are numbers that are typically written in decimal, negative or positive with a decimal. Quite large values can be put into these 64-bit floating point numbers. Or alternatively, you can use hexadecimal scientific notation. So just looking at our little familiar echo program, here we have a wonderful function that will accept a floating point number and echo it back with the response. And it's both for type float for the input as well as the response. So here, looking at the candid user interface with the say function, we're going to put in the value, and we will run the query, and it comes back and echoes back the value here on the output. Quite simple, not particularly useful. And here, doing the same thing with the float value, we're going to put a non-float value in just to see what happens. And here you see Motoko Bootcamp. It comes back and says it's not a number, throwing a warning out. As part of the Motoko base library, there are Motoko modules for each type. The module contains values and functions that are useful when handling values of the type. In this case, float. The float type has a corresponding Motoko module that can be imported into a smart contract using the reserved word import. And we reference the location of the base module and we assign it a name. Now the float module has a lot of functions and values that are useful, and I'm just showing their names here. So when dealing with imported modules, there is a fantastic documentation resource online at internetcomputer.org and the developer docs, where they have all the information about the Motoko programming language. We can just do a search here, and I'm going to look for a float, and you'll see that it pops up and says type float. So if I go click on type float, it's going to bring up the module documentation. And here we can see how it's defined and all of the values, and they've got some functions in here, and it's all documented in detail beyond just providing the name of the function. So the things that I'm particularly interested in would be the min and max functions, because we're going to use them in the example. But here you can see that the minimum, I guess it's called a value in this case, the minimum takes two arguments, two floating point arguments, and it will yield a floating point number. And what it does, it returns the smaller value of x and y. So this is the detailed documentation for the particular thing that we're going to be using. In case you're interested in looking at the actual module source code, it's published on Affinity's GitHub in the Motoko-based repository, and it's under the source directory, src, and you'll find the module source code. You'll find for every single type, there's going to be like a blob.mo and a float.mo, bool.mo, all of the types. Just go and explore there, and you'll see how the code is written, and often where there are some holes in the documentation, it's useful for you to familiarize yourself with the actual source code. So let's put this all together. So given two numbers, I'd like to have a smart contract to tell me which one is the minimum. And also given two numbers, I would like to have the smart contract tell me which one is the maximum. And I know that I want to use functions from the float module. Therefore, I will import the float module right off of the bat. And then I define a function called findMax, which takes two arguments, x and y, and it will pass it to the function float.max. So max is the function in the float module, and we are referring to the float module because these match. And it will return a value that is also float per the documentation. Likewise, to find the minimum, I created a function called findMinimum. It accepts two values, x and y, of type float. It's going to call the min function from the float module and pass the x and y values to it, and it will give me the response on which of those two numbers is the minimum. So here we've got our canister deployed, and we've got two functions in that canister, findMax and findMin. And I'm just going to use the candid user interface in the Motoko Playground to show you how that would work. So here we've got two numbers. I'll put in two numbers, 56 and 99, and I'll ask it to tell me which one is the maximum, findMax. Does the query, comes back with a result. And I'll scroll down and put two numbers in for findMin. So this number and the number 8. And it comes back, says the minimum between those two numbers is 8. Now there is a module that can be imported for each type that we've discussed. And I'm only showing on this particular screen the full nat8 and int8. I'm not showing the other libraries for the higher precision nat 16, 32, and 64, or int 16, 32, and 64, because the functions are basically the same as int8 and nat8. But these are all the functions that you can call as part of the modules or values, depending on how they're defined. And it gives you a lot of capabilities. So I'm not going to be going through this now, but it's worthwhile to explore all of these online using the online documentation. Another interesting element of Motoko is something called optional types. If we were to have a DApp that was going to maintain the list of names of pet snakes that people have, maybe it's a group of snake enthusiasts, and they would like to know what is the name of a pet snake, they declare the variable of type text, and they assign the name, in this case Floyd. But somebody actually doesn't own a pet snake. They're a snake enthusiast, then they would like to be able to buy one in the future, but they don't yet have one. Well, when you declare a variable of type text, it cannot hold an empty value. So that's where the optional type comes in. By adding the question mark in front of the type declaration, so in this case, the red question mark in front of text, will allow you to assign a null value to that actual variable. And this works for functions and for return values as well. So while the optional declaration is very useful, it also means that you have to deal with it throughout, because now you've introduced a new type. So if you look at the first echo program here on the left, you can see that I've declared the phrase that I'm going to echo as being optional, and I'm going to assign it a value here. I'm going to say hello folks. In this situation, hello folks cannot be directly assigned to text. You have to state that it's actually an optional value that we're putting in there. And this, conversely, on this side, here I'm dealing with the hello folks. I've correctly dealt with it here, but I'm going to return the value phrase. But I've said that the return value is just text, and you will get an error when you're compiling this in the IDE that will say that phrase is not of type text, it's actually of type optional text. So you have to make sure that things match, just like all other types. Now, converting from an optional type to a non-optional type typically is done through the switch case logic, which I'm not going to cover off today. It'll be covered off elsewhere. But I just didn't want to leave you hanging saying, well, there's nothing to be done. There is, and it's the switch case logic. The last subject we're going to cover today is loop and while. So loop is a reserved word, and it creates a loop that goes forever until you either return, break, or timeout. So in this case, I've created a function that is going to repeat a number of times. I'm just going to pause for a second. I'm getting some comments that the sound is unstable and quite a bit apart. So I'm not sure if there's lag on some people's networks. So we'll just see if we can pause it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so we hear you smoothly on our end, so that must be on their end. The great thing about this is we're going to make sure that the raw recording is available. So that way, if you're having network issues right now, it would be good.
Excellent. Okay, and I'll continue then. And the other thing I'd like to say for our Spanish listeners is that the subtitles will be available in that recorded video. I believe we've got the actual raw YouTube, so I will hit play then. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted.
We're going to pass the number of times as an argument to it, a natural number, and it's going to go through and loop. And each time it's going through, it's going to increment a counter. And if the counter exceeds or is equal to the number of times, it will then return the counter. And once the return is done, it will break out of the loop, and that's it for the loop. And of course, it will return the value, and then we'll see that come through. A similar construct is the while command. While may execute if conditions are met. And in this case, I've defined a actor called while maker, and I've got two values, counter and earned. Both are natural numbers. And if I call this function called conditional repeat, it's going to check right off the bat to see if the counter is less than 10 and if earned is less than 100. And if this is true, it will then execute this block of code. If it is false, well, then it will fall through and go to the return and return the value. So in this case, we can see I ran the conditional repeat function. I queried it, and it executed and came back with the response of 100 times. Two simple constructs, but very useful. Homework for this module is pretty simple. The first task I'd like you to do is to find the Motoko documentation on internetcomputer.org. Really, I'd just like you to locate it and be able to locate particular modules. So in this case, go out and find the blob module documentation. And the blob module has a function called hash, and that will return a value. So the question I have is, what is its type? And I'm just sending you out on a wild goose chase to try and find the documentation so you can see how it works and how it's located. The second task, write a smart contract that will accept two integers as input and multiply those two numbers together and return the value. The third task, I'd like you to add 10.3 to the value and return the square root of x times y plus 10.3. For those of you that are watching this according to the scheduled time for the Motoko Bootcamp, we're going to go over to a live session now. For those of you who are watching this pre-recorded at a later time, thanks for listening. Yeah, so I do have a live question here. Someone's asking about, I missed the beginning of the lecture. Can you go over what the type of blob is, please? A blob is a binary large object. So it can hold a lot of binary values. For example, a file, a sound, MP3, that could be stored in a blob. So it's a very large array of natural 8 numbers. In terms of blobs being a value and key pair, you're going to hear a lecture a little bit downstream on things called hash maps, and I think they're going to be talking about some other data structures as well, which are beyond the primitive stuff that I'm dealing with in this particular lecture.
Yeah, my question, can you hear me now?
I can.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, my question was, it appeared that all the vars that were declared were at the canister level. Is it possible to declare variables within functions that are local to the function?
Yes, they are. If you were to look at the slides again with the minimum and maximum example, and I'll just, I think I can, I'm not sure where that one was, but I'll just see if I can just pop it up here. When you define a variable inside of a function, there, right here, can you see that? If you notice on the screen here, I've got find max x and y is actually defined just within the scope of this function, because I use the same variables down here, but they're actually different variables.
Okay, I see that. Is that only in the declaration part of the query function that you have there?
Yeah,
Or
that's where
I could
that's
do separate bars.
yeah, I'll just make this larger. I've made that I've declared that variable inside of the arguments here, and that
Yeah.
is the actual declaration for that function only. So if I was to call in find max, if I had have used the variable a and b, I couldn't refer to a and b here because it's not within the scope of this block.
Right. So in this case, you don't need the var.
I don't exactly. I have set a var x and y, but I don't have to declare it outside. Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
I'd like to go over, just going to bring up Motoko Playground for a second, just to show you this product, because it's extremely useful if you haven't played with it before. And I'll just try and find out where I've got this at this time. Unfortunately, I can't see it with the screen. There we go. All right. So this is Motoko Playground, and if I was to start it from scratch, I can bring up predefined projects as examples. So I've got a counter program here. For example, I'm going to use a hello world function. And I can go into the source code here of the program. And this is like an IDE where I can actually go in and change things. So some things that are interesting to play with is making errors. And I had a very hard time, as I said before, with the types. When I started out, I had come from an environment where we didn't use types at all in the language that I was using. This is totally new to me. So I like making errors in Motoko Playground because it shows me what happens when you do make an error. So in this case, I want to pass an argument that says, I'm going to pass a phrase called text, and I'm going to return the value phrase back, which is also of text. But let's just for fun say that this is a gnat. I'm going to change this to a gnat. And now you can see that it's going to complain. And what does it say? It says the expression of type gnat cannot produce an expected type of text. So it's saying that when I return this phrase, which has been declared as gnat, it doesn't match the return value, which is supposed to be type text. So you can see right off the bat that there are problems. And when you're using your IDE, if you're using something like Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, you'll get errors from the system that'll indicate this. But these are very, very good hints that you're messing up on the type system. So in this case, let's say I wanted to take that gnat and have it actually return a gnat. Well, I could just change the gnat type here. The other thing I want to mention is when you're importing values, and I'm just going to stop and see, have you published the text of the homework assignment somewhere? No, I will send that to you. That's a screenshot. I don't think I can paste a document here, so I will send that out. When you do an import, let's say if I'm going to import and I want to deal with the text module. So I'm going to go and I'm going to import the module from the base library, and I'm going to call it text. And here I can call in functions that are in the text library. When I'm referring to this, this text, some people say, well, what's this for? This is to set the namespace for all the functions that sit in the base text library. So I could have called this, I am a friend of, I'm a friend of text. And then when I'm referring to functions in there, I could say something like return phrase, I am a friend of text, dot to text of this nat value. If I wanted to do that, because to text is in that particular function. I've made a spelling mistake there. But my point is that this is particularly useful to pull up. Sorry, I've just got a window here that's hidden. There we go. It's very useful to work through problems in this environment. Often when we're doing troubleshooting online, we'll just use this as a scratch pad to deal with Motoko issues and see how things go from there. And the nice thing is that you can deploy the code, install it, run it, and it will give you a nice candid interface on the right side. And here we can push a value into the counter. Now, I'm not doing anything with the actual phrase, but I can just run a query and it comes back and gives me my value. All right, so that's covers off what I want to show you there.
So would you recommend using this Motoko Playground over using an IDE like Visual Studio for testing our functions first before we deploy it on?
It's a good spot to try things out, but no, the IDE is a better environment to use things because your code is under your control. These, in the Motoko Playground, the canisters that you create are only persistent for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, you have to redeploy. So if you were to want to save state beyond, you would lose everything every 20 minutes like clockwork. The other thing is that they reuse the canister names. So you have to be aware that there is security on what you're doing here. But it is a very good environment to practice and try things out. And the other thing that you can do is you can save and share. So if I want to save and share this, it will share the code and it will give me a reference right down here that I share with participants, let's say in this class, and they could click on it and load it up and then make it their own and play with it further.
Can you go over the principal variable area as well? It's related to the blob functionality, right? Or variable?
So principal holds principles, which are typically, I can bring up the reference actually from the documentation.
And then after this, we also have Charles on the line who had a question as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the teachings. I just have a few questions about the, not really about the functions, but about the actors. There are two questions actually, but it's still actually on the actor. The first question is that, is it possible to have two actors in a file? Okay, I mean like in a code. Okay, so you having the first actor, then still making another actor. And if we were to have that, like when is the right time to use that, like having multiple actors in a code? I don't know if you understand the question.
Yeah, and I'm not certain, I'm not 100% certain of the answer for that. I do believe that you can have only one actor in a single canister. And that has not changed, I do not believe, but I will verify that and confirm. Okay.
Yeah. There's only one actor per canister, and it's really just something you declare when you're declaring a canister. And there's a whole section of documentation specifically on actors. It's not a type. It's a whole nother distinct thing in and of itself, unique to Internet Computer. So I recommend looking for that documentation and finding it. It's just as easy as using the search bar in the documentation website.
So just going back to the question on principles, there's a whole definition here on the internetcomputer.org site, the documentation for the type principle. I just did a search of type principle, and principles are the user and canister smart contract IDs. So if you were to take a text value of a principle and you want it to turn it into a principle, you can take it, move it from a principle to text or from text to a principle using these functions.
We also have one question here from John Paul. So I just allowed you to talk. You may go ahead and unmute.
Hello, just a quick question. I'm just confused. We can only have one actor per canister, but we can have multiple canisters in one project, right?
Correct.
I don't know.
That is correct.
Thank you, thank you.
So a question about having query in front of a function. What if we were to run find max and find min without the query function? Query tells the compiler and it tells the module that it does not have to go through consensus to get the answer. So if you were to take away the word query, it would try to run the function, or it would run the function through consensus. And if you were to update a variable in that function, it would write that to the subnet ledger if it was a function without query. With query, it's not going to be doing any writing.
All right, Dima Madison, you're able to speak now. You may unmute.
Hello, everyone. I'm having a question about principle. So basically, there are two types of principles, user and smart contract ID. So is like user and canister smart contract ID different entities or like sort of the same thing?
So a smart contract can also be an actor, as can a identity can be calling functions. So both can call both are principals that can call other canisters and other methods of other contracts.
So basically, they're the same. They have the same functions, and
Yet they're handled the same way in terms of the library.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right, Dan Kimball's got a question here. So you may unmute.
Yeah, just to clarify around the blob function, as I understand it, it's basically a large binary object that can be hashed and return the hash, and so it's just kind of a functionality or a kind of a typing that allows for the creation of hashes from large binary objects. Is that basically what it's all about?
So it's not just about hashing. It's a mechanism to store an array of values all together. So you can generate a hash from it, but you can also manipulate the blob and do comparisons, like what I'm showing here. And you can pop it into an array and pull it from an array to manipulate it. So for example, I'm writing a function right now that is taking a wave file and I'm consuming it as a blob, and then I want to manipulate it. But the easiest way is to get the whole thing in as a blob.
Does that answer your question, Dan, or do you have anything else you want to add?
No, that basically answers it. I guess I didn't realize that. Yeah, you can basically put a large array of multiple different multiple different file types, like say a linked list or something is in a big array, and that could be typed as a blob, and then you could hash the whole thing. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah. They're not easy to manipulate, but it can sometimes be a good transfer, like a type for transferring methods from data from the front end to the back end.
Okay, great. No, I get it. I'll have to look at the documentation, of course.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dan. We also have a question here in the Q&A, Ted. Does an optional type simply include all functions of that type in addition to a null output, or does the code need to be written twice with one copy of the code, including the question mark?
So all the functions of the type of the base type come along with the optional type. The only addition is that you're able to store the null value in the field, and you have to handle the exceptions with a case and switch, because you have to deal with the fact that you're going to have that null, and a lot of the other functions may not know what to do with it, so you have to make sure that you handle it. You can't pass the optional value to a function that's that has a type that is not optional. So that's where the switch case comes in.
Perfect. And we have, Dima has another question. All right, Dima, you're allowed to unmute if you want.
Yeah, just maybe a quick one about query words. So basically, we need to use it whenever we don't want to publish it to the IC, or well, technically we do publish it to the IC, but like keep it within the canister, or Like, what's the difference between just storing it on the IC or updating the ledger?
So you've got orthogonal persistence within a canister. So when you say a variable is equal to 35, if you're putting that inside of a function that can write to the ledger, you can't put a query in there, right?
Mhm.
So the query is not going to go through consensus.
Which means like it's not going to be published through subnet.
Correct.
So
Okay. Okay.
you're with a query, you're just reading state, you're not changing state. So when you're changing state on an immutable ledger, it takes more work than if you're just going to read the state from that immutable ledger. So that's the main difference there. Basically, if you can make it a query because it's not actually updating state, make it a query.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So we have a question written out here in the Q&A by Dylan Foley. Are blobs the main way that media such as sound, video, or PDFs, for example, are stored on chain? And can they serve those resources? Yeah, my understanding is basically yes. And I mean, blob is like binary. You can think of it as just like raw binary. That's what a blob is. Anything to add to that, Ted?
No, and no, blobs are hard to manipulate and hard to pull values from, unfortunately. But that's what most people are doing. So blobs.
All right, well, we're just at the top of the hour here. I think we've touched on all of these questions, but there are a few out here, Ted, where they wanted to see that last screen with your tasks.
Yeah, I'll send that to you momentarily.
Okay, yeah, perfect. And
I was assigning that as homework. I was not assigning that as something that I need to see come back and correct or something like that. It's just for them to, like, the documentation search, take the time to find the documentation on the internetcomputer.org. It's important. It's so important for every other lesson that you're about to do in here. And the exercises are more for them to confirm that they're learning the basics.
exactly. There's just a few bookmarks, and like the documentation site's one of them, but there are a few bookmarks that are just going to be really key to have handy as you go through this learning journey. So I definitely second you and all that, Ted. And just to make it clear to everybody, these aren't graduate requirement challenges. The GitHub has all of those that are like required for the daily coding challenges and stuff. These are extras. We asked the dev mentors to include whatever additional extra like interactive work could help with learning material. So this is something that's recommended, but not necessarily strictly required, but definitely a good practice to do because you need to get familiar with the documentation and navigating it. All right. So
all right. Well, thanks everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Ted. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And before I end the call, I just want to mention one thing. So Ted has faithfully been the host of the weekly Dfinity Dev calls. So we have a lot of devs who every Friday, they join just a weekly community call. And Dfinity will usually have someone show up to give an update, but it's really a community event. And Ted has been the host of those. since I can remember, since the Genesis, I guess, is for a really long time, and it's been great for the ecosystem, and so thanks, Ted, not just for this, but for all you do for the community. And I hope keep an eye out for it. It's on a Discord. There's a Dfinity Dev official Discord, and yeah, if you start diving into Motoko, it'd be a good idea to try to start joining those calls each week. It's not Dfinity. What's it called, Seb? Internet Computer Community. Yeah, let's get an announcement with the link out there. That'd be nice. All right. Well, anyway, everybody's have a good rest of your day, and we got one more lecture coming up, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.